Okay, so hello everyone, good morning, afternoon or evening. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, and welcome to our last NoBeC talk of this year. We will have a very similar agenda to previous talks. First, I'm going to give you a very short welcome. Then we will have the NoBeC Early Career Researcher pre-recorded video for this week, which is Nina Xue from Monash University. And then we will have our main speaker for today, Professor Stephan Meier from Columbia Business School. And then at the end, we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. A brief reminder, as I always do, that the NoBeC Talks speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center at the University of Pennsylvania that works on consulting, research, and training with organizations that want to sustainably enact positive behavioral change. Here's our link if you want to learn more, and here's a QR code to our Twitter account in which we post our updates. Before proceeding, we also wanted to share with you our spring 2022 programming. You have the full list of speakers here and dates. Basically, we are starting on the 13th of January with Dave Rand from MIT, and then we will have talks every 2 weeks for now. Yeah, we are announcing until April, but our plan is to continue further, of course. For more information, as always, you can go to our web page or scan this QR code. If this is the first time that you're joining, remember a few ground rules. Please mute yourself during the talk. If you want, please keep your camera on so that you have a more interactive experience. This time we have 2 co-authors in the audience, so feel free to ask any questions or write any comments in the chat during the talk. And then in the Q&A at the end, you can use the raise hand function to ask your questions. And as always, we are transmitting live on Facebook. You can find the video there. And also the video will be uploaded in our website, like all our previous videos next week. These, let me present our NoBeC Early Career Researcher for this week. Nina Xue is a PhD student from Monash University in Australia. The talk is called Norm Signaling Punishment, and here's a QR code and a link to her website. I'm going to share the video now.
Hi everyone, my name is Nina Xue. I'm a PhD student at Monash University, and today I'll be presenting work that is joined with Daniela Nesenso and Ertis Xiao. So from a legal perspective, punishment can serve an important role in signaling what society deems to be appropriate or inappropriate behavior. And what we're interested in is whether the motive behind punishment matters for its effectiveness. So we compare 2 types of punishment. The first is what we call self-serving punishment. So here, the principal uses punishment to try to change the agent's behavior in order to benefit themselves. The second type is what we call other regarding punishment. So here, again, the principal uses punishment to try to change the agent's behavior, only this time to benefit a third party. So our first research question is punishment less effective when it is interpreted as self-serving as opposed to other regarding? And secondly, does self-serving punishment transmit a weaker normative message than other regarding punishment? So our first game was designed to model self-serving punishment. So we have 3 players, and player B chooses between the communal project, which gives equal payoffs, and the exclusive project, which gives higher payoffs to 2 players and excludes a third. So in this case, A is excluded. Before player B makes their choice, player A decides whether or not to impose a fee for player B choosing the exclusive project. And so we use the strategy method to elicit B's choices, so 1 conditional on punishment and 1 conditional on no punishment. And player C is just a passive player here. So our second game models other regarding punishment. And the only difference here is that in the exclusive project, it is now between A and B, and C is the excluded player. And so one thing to note is that for player B, their payoffs are exactly the same in both games, and punishment in our context is weak. So player B is always better off choosing the exclusive project, even under punishment. We also elicit normative beliefs from our player C, so our third party, and we elicit their first order beliefs, second order beliefs, and empirical beliefs. So our first main result is that other regarding punishment is effective at discouraging selfish choices. You can see that in the right here. So we have a larger proportion of communal choices under punishment compared to no punishment. And we don't see any effect really of punishment when it's self-serving. We can also look at player B's strategies. So EPCP, for example, here means that under no punishment, they choose exclusive, and under punishment, they then switch to communal. So here, punishment is effective at constraining self-interest. So we can see here that for game 2, we see a larger proportion where punishment is effective relative to game 1. And for game 1, we see that we actually have a sizable portion where punishment actually backfires. Turning now to norms, we find that the stigma of making a selfish choice is higher under other regarding punishment than under self-serving punishment. So in this table, I'm presenting the relative appropriateness of choosing the exclusive project over the communal one under punishment. So a positive number here means that people believe it's relatively more appropriate to choose exclusive under punishment. And a negative number means that people believe it's relatively more appropriate to choose communal under punishment. So you can see across all our beliefs, under punishment, the stigma of choosing exclusive over communal is lower under self-serving punishment than it is under other regarding punishment. And so all of these differences are significant. So our main takeaways, firstly, we find that other regarding punishment is effective at discouraging selfish behavior, while self-serving punishment can actually sometimes backfire. We also find that other regarding punishment increases the social stigma of self-interested behavior. And finally, something we didn't necessarily expect, we find both the choice to punish and the choice not to punish can send a normative message to agents. Thanks very much for your time and attention. We would be very happy to receive questions or feedback, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminar.
Great. Thank you so much, Nina, for the talk. Unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions as in previous occasions, but I see Nina in the audience, so please feel free to write any comments or questions or anything in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much again. And with that, let me introduce our main speaker for today. Professor Stephan Meier is the chair of the Management Division and the James P. Gorman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. He was previously a senior economist at the Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision Making at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. and taught courses on strategic interactions and economic policy at Harvard University and the University of Zurich. His work has been published in leading academic journals, including the American Economic Review and Management Science, and has been profiled by the press, such as The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and New York Times. The talk for today is called Gender Differences in Meaningful Work, Drivers and Implications. And our moderator, as in previous occasions, is Dr. Oidon Demand, an associate professor of practice in behavioral and decision sciences here at Penn, and a core member of our center. So thank you so much for joining, Professor Meier, and yeah, feel free to share your screen.
Sure, okay. I assume you can see this.
Yes.
Looks
Perfect.
great.
So thank you so much for having me here. So I thought a little bit about what to present here, and I'm working on a couple of different things. You know, one is on incentives and vaccination. I'm spending a lot of time right now, but I'm super excited about this particular project because it's also the right moment to get feedback. We just finished a first rough draft. This is the first time I'm presenting it. You know, as you see, I just changed the title slightly. And so feedback on any types would more than welcome. This is also great that it's a very interdisciplinary group because as you see, you know, there is like, while most of us on the team are like a heavy economics background, and I'm referencing economics throughout the talk more, but of course it like taps into like research that has been done in psychology, in organizational behavior, and sociology, and other disciplines. So we will be more than happy to get like, you know, what are we missing? What literature should we talk about and should reference? So this is joint work with Vanessa Burbano, is not here, and Ole Folke and Johanna Rickne, who are on this call and joining us from Sweden. Now, I could go on and talk about Twitter because that project actually started on Twitter, but I spare you that particular discussion for another time. So Ole and Joanna are happy to answer any question in the chat, and then also when at the Q&A at the end are going to join us for the more general discussion. So as the title is here, so this is about the female advantage and meaning of work, drivers and implication. I want to start with, you know, something quite obvious. You know, work is extremely important in our lives. You know, we spend a lot of time at work. A lot of time of the hours we are awake has to be in work. And in economics, traditionally, we focus mainly on one aspect of a job, which is monetary, the monetary aspects. You know, wage, job security, fringe benefits of the job, but of course, like job differ in many other aspects of it, and actually workers value those. Not so surprisingly, if you spend so much time at work, you actually care about, you know, how flexible it is and how competitive the work is, and there has been recent studies doing so. But in addition, you know, you care about like you know, some of the corporate culture aspects. You know, Johanna and Ole have an amazing paper on sexual harassment within organization and kind of how much people value to avoiding this. There is, of course, we think about training opportunities, safety, and so forth. Without really talking about those non-monetary aspects or not taking them into account, I think we don't get a full picture of the potential inequality in the labor market. Now, we want to focus on one particular aspect of those non-monetary work, which is meaning of work. This is an area, and I'm going to mention it a little later, which has been basically ignored in economics, not in other fields. You know, there is in psychology and organizational behavior, there's much more work on like the meaning of work. And meaning in particular, you know, of course, is not a new concept at all. So here's a quote from a famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, that has been quoted then in an economics paper by Carlson and Lowenstein. So it's people's innate will to find meaning and not their strive for pleasure, power, and wealth that is the strongest motivation in living. So we believe that meaning is very important, and I'm showing you some empirical results later on that confirms kind of that literature who shows meaning is important for like well-being of individuals. So as I mentioned, you know, in economics that has been a little less covered. I have a survey paper where we talk a little bit about some of the literature, but it's still coming up more. Now, when we talk about meaning, we have to define it a little bit, or at least tell like where our sources of meaning come from. And I want to talk a little bit more about that when I go into the empirics of it. But we think about it as, and we follow kind of a methodology by this paper that I'm citing here, is like the first three areas: autonomy, competency, and relatedness are related to like self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. You know, like we strive for like some autonomy, agency of what we're doing. We strive for that our skills are like used to the best way. We don't feel we don't particularly like it, or we don't get meaning out of it if we're under or over stretched. We care about relatedness, connections to other. And in addition, that fourth one, which is also going to be very important going forward, is kind of the prosocial act of the work. So how does it help other people? You can think about this as well as, you know, the job design. You know, do I actually have an impact? And how does the work look like? And the mission, what is the job actually doing? You know, do I work in a children's hospital? That's probably very good on the prosocial act, but it could also be that on that particular front, you know, children's hospital might not be the best in terms of autonomy and so forth and so on. If we don't understand how meaning actually impacts work and how to think about meaning as a part of a non-monetary aspect of a job, I think we will not completely understand some of the inequalities in the labor market. Now, one particular inequality that we want to focus on in this is gender. You know, we're well aware that there is a very persistent gender gap in the labor market, substantial inequality when it comes to wages and gender. What we want to add here, what about meaning at work? And there are a bunch of indicators that meaning of work might be important to take into account. One is there is some preferences for female for a particular type of meaning at work that I document in another paper. More interesting and more related to what we're doing here, it looks like, and here are two papers from the US who show that female actually experience more meaning at work. The figure that I plot here is from the second paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by Kaplan and Schulhofer-Wohl, who shows that over time, you know, and the methodology is here, like they have time use studies, and then they actually predict backwards in what jobs females were in the 50s and whatever. In that particular methodology, it looks like, you know, females had a job that created not much meaning in the past, and now overturned the men, and at the moment they have a higher meaning at work than men have. This is kind of the starting point where we start, where we try to document also, do we see that in a different setting, which allows us to dig a little deeper into where that comes from. I want to mention another aspect of how we think gender and or this taking meaning into account might be important to understand the full extent of like inequality in the labor market. And that's kind of this grievance-based politics and meaning of work. You know, that the radical right is rising in the popularity in many countries, and that has been linked to this kind of economic grievance in the labor market. As I'm going to show you later, you know, they're mainly men, low-skilled workers who are the base of this radical right, And we want to think about, and when I show you the results, it becomes clear why this is on top of our mind, but meaning or the lack thereof for those particular groups within the labor force might actually explain part or might be one aspect why they're going to be more radical and like join those more populist right parties. So with that, I want to just go to the questions that the research question. You know, the first one is like, we want to document whether there is this female advantage in meaningful work, whether we can replicate it, and we can. I'll show you that then, but what drives it? You know, where does that really come from? And we're going to mainly look at three potential channels. You know, one is kind of a life cycle explanation. We know that a lot of the inequality in the change of labor wage gap comes from the first child. So when, and I'm going to show you that in our data as well, you know, when men and women have their first child, the female are actually the one who's taking a hit on both the wages, and are the ones who are going to transition into more part-time jobs than the men. How does that explain something about the meaningful work? Second is vertical segregation. We know that female are underrepresented on hierarchically higher jobs. Does that explain part of this female advantage in meaningful work? And third, you know, is this horizontal segregation into different occupation. We also know that that's true. Can that explain part or all of that female advantage? And if yes, so why? What type of jobs are the ones, and why do men not get into those jobs more? We then wanted to end with kind of some implications that I alluded to before. You know, one in the gender wage gap. Can we say something about whether the female advantage in meaningful work contributes or compensates a little bit, at least, for the differences in wage? And second, can we say something about this political mobilization? Does meaning of work or the lack thereof for certain groups within the population might explain why they're more likely to be in more populist radical right movements or parties? So without, the outline is very traditional, so I'm going to talk about methods. First, in particular, like talk about our different measures that we have, both for meaning, but also then for the other aspects that we care about. Then I document that female advantage in our setting, and then go through those explanations one on one, and then talk about the implications at the end. So here's the data and the methods that we're using. I think the data set we're having has a bunch of features which makes that particularly a nice opportunity to study this. It comes from the Swedish Work Environment Survey. That's a biannual survey, which at this point has like 12 waves, starting in 91, 2015. And the survey is really about the map, kind of the work condition in the labor market in Sweden. A lot of the questions that we are using, in particular, most of the dependent variable on meaning of work comes from that work survey. We have about more than 110,000 observations. This is not a panel, so this is a repeated cross-section. And about 50% of the sample is female. Now, what is remarkable and very unique, I think, from in the Swedish setting, is that we can now match those measures to the survey responses to administrative records to measure precisely what their income level is, their sector of employment, their occupation. We know exactly when they have children, and a bunch of other aspects that we can now know very precisely from the administrative data. And I think this feature of like matching the survey to those administrative data will help us a lot to say something more concrete about what's going on. Some of you will see that the numbers of observation vary. That mainly has to do with, you know, sometimes the 4-digit occupation code was only introduced later in the sample and so forth. So it depends. So the number of observation vary. because of data availability of different measures. I'm going to skip through that. This is just, we compare kind of the survey sample and the population average in Sweden. And I don't think there is anything that stands out here. So it's pretty representative of the general Swedish population, which is exactly what it was designed for. But we confirmed that that's actually true. Now, some of the key variables, one of our main variables that we're going to use throughout the talk, and is going to be extremely important because it's our dependent variable most of the time, is this question which asks participants, do you experience your work as mostly meaningless or meaningful? And they answer this on a 5-point scale. So 1 to 5, 5 being very meaningful. So the average is about, as you see here, about almost 4 with a standard deviation of 1. And I also plotted here kind of the distribution of it. So there is about 70% think their job is very meaningful or relatively meaningful, and there are about 7% to find it very meaningless. But there is of course variance here, which we're going to exploit. So this is the main variable that we're going to use in the rest of the talk. There is a bunch of other key variables, which some of them go through a little faster. So we have a question on hierarchical position. Are you leading or delegating work to others? Yes, no, and then how many? There is socio-demographics. Some of them come from the survey. Most of them come from the administrative data. We have occupational, industry level, which is going to be important as well on the 2, 3, and 4 digits. So getting more and more precise. And we're going to use those as well heavily. And then we have 2 more measures, or a couple of more measures, but 2 more sets of measures that I want to spend a slightly bit more time on. One is this pathway that I mentioned before on meaningful work. This is what I mentioned before about kind of the source of meaningful work. The first 3 that are here is directly related to like self-determination theory. So it's about autonomy, and we use a composite of 4 questions. As you read through or skim through them, they're about, can you determine, can you decide yourself? How free or unfree are you to take, and so forth. There is one on competency, which is about, it's far too easy or far too hard or just right, given my abilities. And then there is one on relatedness, which is also a composite of a bunch of questions, which has to do, well, how is actually the relationship within the organization with either my managers, or also other stakeholders within the organizations, being that colleagues or clients. The last, which comes not from the survey, is about how prosocial the work is. And here we use ONET measures. If those of you are not familiar with that, that's like a data set in the US who tries to qualify kind of occupational traits and work for conditions. So asks a bunch of experts about many dimensions, how the job, this is the measure that, in David Otter, who uses automation, that's like ONET is used to figure out what job is easy to automate or is easy to be outsourced or offshored. And we are using 4 variables that I haven't seen others using before, but I might be wrong. Where we kind of classify how much is a job, has about concern for others, is social, is like service oriented, or is assisting and caring for others. And we're going to use that to capture kind of dimensions of a job that are more, I would call them more prosocial. Last but not least, we have a measure on female male stereotypical type index. So the question here is, are there certain jobs that are more female stereotypical? So we use 3 previous research papers that quantify that. Here is one example of one of them who asks participants to score 80 occupation on a 1 to 7 scale on how much this is for male or for female. There is another of those measures which is pretty similar. There is one who looks like at Google searches, how many pictures come up of male and female if you type in certain types of occupation. We take all those together and then match them to the jobs that we have, the occupations that we have in the Swedish data set. And we can match about 62 of the observation with at least one of those index. As almost most of the independent variables, we then standardize them to have a mean of 0 and the standard deviation of 1. Okay. Again, so I'm just continuing, or is there anything?
No, it's going great.
Okay,
feel free to move on.
Okay, perfect. So before I show you the result, I want to show you quickly, kind of give you at least some confidence, hopefully, in that meaning at work measure that we have captures something real that is going on, not just noise. One is on this graph, you see the dependent variable is meaningful work, or in standard deviations, and then we regress them on those 4 characteristics that we talked about: autonomy, those pathways, and or including then log wage as well. And what you see here is like not so surprisingly and consistent with that work, who shows like what actually creates meaning. More autonomy creates more meaning, more competency in the job creates more meaning, more relatedness creates more meaning, and jobs that are higher on those prosocial indicators are creating more meaning as well. And all of the, higher wages are correlated with that measure as well. So on this, we want to take this away as like, kind of a sanity check, whether that actually is correlated with what we expected to correlate it. We can also do a little bit more and either show more indicators which would show that what we are capturing here is actually something that happens in the job and is valued, or if it's missing, people actually want to change something. So what you see here is regressions. Some of them, it starts with controls, and then we add kind of demographics, year fixed effects, those job traits that I just showed you, and like workplace fixed effects. And what you see here is on the first 2 columns. So there's woman on the top panel and man on the bottom panel. And then the first 2 on the left are about job satisfaction. So what you should take away from there is like it correlates our measure of meaningful work correlates strongly with job satisfaction, but not perfectly. So it's about the 0.5 coefficient here in those regressions. In the survey, they asked people about whether they're thinking about leaving the job, and the more meaning they have in a job, the lower is their intention. This is just self-reported intention to leave. And then the last column is about actually from the administrative data, how many people change their jobs. If you look on the administrative data of Statistics Sweden, how many changed their jobs 3 years after they got surveyed. And again, you see like the higher they report their meaningfulness on their job right now, the less likely they're actually going to be in a different job 3 years down the road. So all those different should give you some confidence, or at least does give us some confidence that we're measuring something real and important here. So let me quickly stop here if there is any questions about design. Otherwise, I'm going to go into going through the results.
I think we're good on the design.
Okay. Yeah. So let me show you the results. So this is just to illustrate 2 things. One is that there is a female advantage in meaningful work over time. Well, maybe 3 things. There is a female advantage in meaningful time. How it develops over time and who is, if it changes over time, who is losing somehow. So what you're going to see here is that throughout the whole, so on the left-hand side, we plot kind of the self-reported meaningfulness at work. So again, this is a 1 to 5 scale. And then there is the circles are female and the triangles are men. And you see throughout the whole period, there is an advantage. Female report higher meaningfulness at work. On the left hand, you actually see the estimated difference between men and women. So in 91, there was about a 0.1 standard deviation difference in meaningfulness at work. So there is a difference throughout the whole period. Second, the difference is increasing. You in particular see that on the right-hand side panel. You know, the difference increases from 91 to then 2015, and by there it's almost like a 0.25 standard deviation difference in meaningful work. And last but not least, it's mainly the men who are losing some of the, while there is a slight upward trend for female, but it's mainly the men who are losing on meaningful work. So this is now just summarizing what we just see here. This is consistent with what the US, with those 2 papers that we are aware of, who document that in the US, and so we're taking this kind of as a starting point. Now, much more important and interesting is now the question, where does that actually come from? As I mentioned before, again, there's 3 aspects that we looked at. One is changes, and I'm now going through them one by one. Let me start with the first one. So changes in the work environment. We actually do know from a bunch of papers that have been published in the past that first parenthood really triggers kind of increased gender inequality in the labor market. And there's a bunch of papers. What we show you here is actually from our data. So those are the people in our sample. And now if you look at the graphs are similarly constructed as the one I showed you before. So on the left-hand side, there is the raw difference, you know, and there's log labor on top, or the participation, part-time work on the bottom, and then for male and female. And you see, and then there is 0 is like the birth of your first child for men and women who actually have a first child. And then you see what happens afterwards. And on the right-hand side, you actually see that plotted the difference with some standard errors in like a regression framework. And you see that both in labor income and on part-time work, really that first child like changes a lot in what happens in terms of inequality in the labor market when it comes to gender. Now, we want to see whether that's true also for meaningful work. The first indicator that you might get is like this is just over the life cycle. So there are no kids in particular involved here at this point, but you just look at, you know, where does the difference, and you again see like female are almost in all of the different age categories report higher meaningfulness at work. It's a little higher between like the 30s and the 40s. So maybe that has to do with kids or not. Now, if we actually look at the same graph that I showed you before, but now as the dependent variable, that meaningfulness at work, there is basically no change at the first, but with the birth of the first child. So I summarized that there's really no clear change at the first parenthood. So that can be what drives kind of the difference. The second could be that overrepresentation of men in hierarchical position. Now, I already showed you before that like higher income is actually correlates with higher meaningless to work. So it would be a little surprising if they were if that would explain kind of the female advantage in meaningful work. We also know that because autonomy, for example, is part of the meaningless work, to have, if you actually have more power and you're in a higher position in the organization, you might get more meaning. And that's what we see when you plot here on the left again, is this is now for whether how many numbers of subordinates you have from 0 to then more than 100 and again plotted on the left side first for men and from female. What you see here is like, if you have more subordinates, the job feels more meaningful. Females have across the whole dimension a higher reported meaningfulness. However, the slopes for the man is a little steeper. So the difference then, if you look at the graph on the right, the difference, the gap, or the female advantage actually decreases somehow over with the number of subordinates, or if you go higher up in the organization. So there is not much indicator that like that drives it. So the third last could be there's horizontal segregation. Now we know that there is a quite substantial segregation. The medium woman works in an occupation with 70% women and vice versa. So what we're interested in is, what are women now in more of those meaningful jobs, and what jobs are those? And or do women derive more meaning out of certain jobs, maybe those female dominated jobs? The first indicator that occupation plays a huge role here in the occupational choice is by when we run a regression where we now add those occupational fixed effects. So when you look at 1 to 2, if there is this female advantage that I showed you before in just the raw data, then we control for demographics and year fixed effects, and the advantage basically stays the same. And now we start to add more finer grained indicators for occupations from like 2 to then 4 digits. And when we go to a much more narrow definition of jobs, a lot of that female advantage gets explained. To put it differently, how females select into certain jobs really explains a lot of why they experience the jobs as more meaningful. The next question is like, what is special about those jobs where a lot of the females select into that then creates a meaningful job? So what do you see in this now are those 4 pathways that you show you before. So what you see in those is correlations, regressions where we look at autonomy, competency, relatedness, and those prosocial factor on the share of women in that particular occupation. So we plot here, how many females are selecting into that and how dominant are females in that particular job. And you see, while there is some correlation, sometimes negative, sometimes positive for the self-determination of like autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the big driver here is whether the job actually has a very prosocial aspect to it when in that 4th column. So this correlation is particularly strong. You can see that also differently here. So this is now regressing on meaningful work and then taking into account kind of the share of the women in the occupation, and then adding those different 4 pathways of what can create meaning. And they're all positively correlated. And you see, while they explain some of it and some of the regression, it really is this prosocial aspect that basically explains why female experience their jobs more meaningfully. To put it differently, the female select into jobs where the beneficency indicator, or how prosocial the job is particularly high. So they select in particular types of jobs. The second question is like, are they men and women getting the same out of those particular jobs. Because so far I just tried to show you that like females select in those pro-social jobs, and that's why they get more meaning out of it. But if a man selects in those jobs, they get the same out of this. So this is now what you see here on the left-hand side. Again, it's like separated by men and women. On the right-hand side, it's the difference. And this is by share of women in the 4-digit occupation category. So you see that positive slope for both men and women. So if they are in those jobs that more women select into, that are also more higher on prosociality, both gain more, but female actually gain more than men do in both of the in those jobs. So it's a little bit of both. So while females select into those jobs that are higher meaning, it's also in those jobs female actually get a little bit more out of it than men do in the same job. So within occupation, there is another way of showing this, and this now brings us to kind of this female stereotypical index. So what you see here on 1, 2, and 3, I don't know whether there is not 1. There's probably, you should think at the first, anyway, the first 2 columns where we add, the meaningfulness as a dependent variable, whether there is this female advantage. If we add those occupation, the female advantage goes down to only 0.1. I showed you that before. But in jobs that are particularly pro-social, female get more out of that. So that's the interaction between pro-social and female. That's true whether we just control for the occupation and or whether we control them for the demographics. 4 and 5 does a similar analysis, but slightly different. Instead of looking at those pro-sociality index, we now look at that female-male stereotypical index, and the same kind of story is true, that female get more out of those jobs that are more female stereotypical in those index. If you put both in it together, it's 6 and 7. None of those are going to, because they're highly collinear as well. So none of them. It's unclear whether it's one or the other that drives this. So if I want to summarize what we have here, we think like this occupational segregation explains a lot of this female advantage. Women are much more likely to be in occupation that are more meaningful, that actually both men and female find more meaningful, and that there are higher levels of like prosociality in terms of what they're doing. Women, however, find those jobs even more meaningful than men. So it's a little bit of both ways that they're in different jobs, but they're also getting more out of that particular jobs. It has, or that's at least how we think about it, and I'm curious to hear what you think. It has, we think, something to do with norms, with like a female stereotypical those jobs is, and that might actually limit a man to attract more meaning by selecting into those what nowadays we often call like pink collar jobs or something like that. I have 10 more minutes, so let me be relatively quick here. So the 2 things we wanted to look at is kind of the gender wage gap and those grievance-based politics. So on the gender wage gap, as I alluded to before, we kind of want to see how much, because we now know, there is a gender wage gap. So female also in Sweden earn less than men. However, female actually get more meaningful out of that. Is part of this compensating for the lower wage? In order to do so, we need to calculate kind of what's the monetary equivalent of meaningful work. So can we say something about how much wage people are willing to give up for more meaningful work? In order to do that, it's really important to control for ability. You're using a method that has been proposed by Bell just recently. We're using education as one of those indicator and regress it on the wage and the amenity, and then use that as an ability measure later to calculate kind of what is the monetary equivalent of that. Before I show you those regressions, what is important to see, and I think what is important for our interpretation also of the second implication, if you just look across the wage distribution, and again, on the left-hand side, it's the different men and women. On the right-hand side, it's just estimated the difference directly. So what you see is most of the meaningful difference in meaningfulness comes on the lower end of the wage distribution. So it's while female are in most of the wage distribution, not on the top end, actually get more meaning out of it. But at the very, very top, it actually flips in the other direction. It's like mainly in those lower end of the income distribution that female have an advantage. This is going to be important when we later talk about, who is going to lose out kind of the meaningful work. And as you see here, it's going to be the ones on the lower end of the man on the lower end of the income distribution. We then try to calculate kind of the compensating pay for meaningful work. And so we do that for both men and female. And what you see here in those regressions, I mean, they're just the normal correlation between meaningfulness and wage. And then we use this Bell compensating pay differential to kind of calculate how much are men and women in those estimations willing to give up. And for a standard deviation increase in meaning, they're about to give up about 6% or explain.
I think we lost Stephan for a sec. Any co-author wants to jump in and just explain the slide in the meantime?
Yeah, I could jump in. So basically the last question, the Bell compensating pay, it's a method for holding ability constant. So basically we can think about ability shifting the offer distribution. So you would want to have jobs with both more meaning and with a higher wage. And this method is a way of trying to look at offer distribution and then see how people choose between jobs on that. And using that method that Bell proposes, we find this compensating pay. So if you get one standard deviation higher meaning at work, or report one standard deviation higher meaning at work, that's associated with having to accept a pay cut of about 5% in wages. So fairly substantial compensating pay, but in a similar, a little bit smaller than the compensation we find for flexibility, for example.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, I mean, the question would be, I don't know what Stephan is running into. Maybe there's some internet issues on his end. He was towards the end. So is there should we just open for some questions? Or do you have the slides and you just want to show whatever we've been missing out? Like, what do you guys want to do? Either thing works for us, obviously.
Let's see if it shows up. I think there's...
Yeah, we don't have the slides, unfortunately. So.
Yeah.
But I mean, we know what the
we
know what the rest is. But.
Yeah, Stephan is coming back. He's coming back. So, Paulius, could you give him a co-host rights and then?
Yes.
All right. There you go, Stephan. We thought you just decided to leave us.
I mean, I knew that it's time for a break. I wasn't aware that my computer also feels the same and so strongly about this. So I'm very sorry about this.
No, you're good. You're good. So we just Ole just finished some of your thoughts on that slide. So feel free to share your slides maybe again, and then you can finish up if you like.
Where was I?
This is the first time a speaker dropped out of doing the presentation, so that's definitely a first.
Okay, I'm not sure that's Good to be the first on that one.
It's all good. It's all good.
Okay. Ola, did you already talk about this? Or?
Yes, I tried, not this one, about compensating pay.
Okay. Well, then we can use. I'm a little off my already shaky game. Where was that? Well, then we try to, take those measures here, and I'll try to see along the income distribution or along the over time, how much does that explain if we take not just the income, but also the value of meaningful work expressed in like extra income, those 6%, into how much does it explain the wage difference and first of all, the difference because the income gap is decreasing over time slightly, and the meaningful gap is increasing over time slightly as well. So it explains a little bit more over time of the wage gap. And on the other side, if you saw it, we saw the most of the difference in meaningful work comes on the lower end of the income distribution. So there it explains about 1/5 of the wage gap is explained by meaningful, by that the jobs are more meaningful. But obviously on the top end of the income distribution, you can't. Also there, the wage difference is much bigger than it is on the lower end of the income distribution. So it explains about 6% of the wage gap in the estimation. So I just summarized this here. The female advantage compensates about for 6%. Yeah, I think the rest I said. So I have 1 more minute. So just to wrap up on this grievance politics, as I said you before, the core of the radical right movement is those low-skilled work. Now, if you remember the distribution over the income level and meaningful work, those are also those with the lowest meaningfulness score and that we have. And on overall, about 9% of men characterize their job as largely meaningless. When you look at people with a high school degree, about 11%, so that's about a 30-something percent, 11 percentage point. So that's about a 37% increase over the mean. And then if you look at like the largest male-dominated one-digit code, which is plant and machinery operators or assemble, that number increases even further. So it's on the lower end of the skill distribution. There are actually less of those meaningfulness. Another way to see that, and for that we use other data that looks at municipality councillors elected in 3 years, starting 2006, and then take as a proxy for the radical right, the Sweden Democrats, which are, my understanding is correct, of the Swedish political landscape, are like the Sweden equivalent of the radical right party. So it's an organized form. And so we look at where are those councillors from the administrative, where do they work? What occupation do they work in? And then we calculate for those occupations, what's the average meaningful or meaningless score? And then we plot this on this graph. So now you see, on one of the axes, the meaningfulness in standard deviation. So if you go more to the right, those are more meaningful jobs, and if you go more to the left, they're less meaningful jobs, and the share of those people in those occupations that are councillors that are now part of the Swedish Democrats. And there is, at least in our interpretation, a very strong, at least correlation, that like people who are councillors and are part of the Swedish Democrats are in jobs that are less less meaningful. So taking this meaningfulness into account might explain why the grievance among certain subgroups, here the low-skilled men, is probably even bigger than we would have assumed by just looking at income. So I think I can stop here and take question, but we look at the drivers on the implication of that female advantage for Sweden, which has a very unique feature of allowing matching survey and administrative data. We see that there's a female advantage which is growing over time. It's mainly due to segregation into prosocial occupations, but those jobs with high beneficence are much more female stereotypes, which might explain why certain men might not get as much out of it and might not select into them. And that has then implications for compensation way differentials and for kind of those grievance-based politics by having a bigger picture of what the inequality in the job market is than by just looking at income.
Great, Stephan. Wonderful presentation. Thanks so much. There was a lot going on in the chat, so your co-authors have been actively taking care of that. So maybe if you want to just leave your slides up in case somebody has questions about something. So I kick off the questions, and then, if anybody has additional questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'll put this in the chat. One thing that I now understand about the data, so my question, you won't be able to answer that, but I just wonder, maybe you have an intuition or maybe a guess is about building meaningfulness over time, right? I know you can't really trace these people. Do you have like an intuition as to whether there's a gender gap in building meaningfulness? Like not only are you, selecting into different occupations, but also over time due to who knows what factors, maybe the wage gap or just your increasing wage shapes your meaningfulness in different ways. Maybe you're just better, or you face different kinds of cognitive dissonance of building meaningfulness, right? So do you think there are different dynamics that could explain part of that over time?
That's a hard one. I don't know whether I can say much about it. Maybe Ole and Joanna, do you have any intuition in that? So we know that it grows over time. Now, I don't think we know, or not even have much of a speculation of why it grows over time differently for men and female, whether they select more in those jobs, or those jobs for whatever competitive reasons. Maybe a lot of the jobs that the men are into are not only, they're also in danger of being outsourced and offshored and automated away.
Yeah, I mean, one intuition that I shared in the chat, which Joanna then addressed was, or Ole addressed, is as the gender wage gap sort of flattens over time, this could affect the extent to which meaningfulness is built, right? Maybe men don't like the women to be closer to their wage level, right? So that affects their meaningfulness, and women, as they get increasing wages, they might be building more, right? But I mean, there are many stories. I just wonder, what do you think could be going on in building meaningfulness?
Yeah, I don't know. Ole, Johanna, yeah.
Perhaps it might be theoretically related to the issue of competence. The longer the tenure you have in a job, the better and more competent you feel at doing it. And so if automation, in Sweden, globalization, yes, that's affected, those big structural changes have affected men more in the sense that they have lost their jobs and their job tenures more. So yeah, that could be a very interesting thing to look at, I think.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, Raven, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question about the framing of this presentation. So you mentioned at the top that you changed the title from gender differences to female advantage. And I was curious about what motivated that decision, and also what is advantageous about being represented more in these prosocial roles.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're actually going back and forth on the title on this. We just wanted to indicate kind of the direction it goes. Maybe advantage, if I understand you correctly, is like a more interpretation than they have higher meaningful.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good point. We have to think about that. You know, what we wanted to, why we did go away from gender differences is just to indicate in what direction it goes.
Mhm.
But I don't think, but Ole and Joanna can correct me, we didn't want it to interpret as much in like, yoo-hoo, that's like the best thing ever. Now
That's
we
how
do
I
have,
took it. I was like, where's the advantage of
yeah,
waiting?
well, we do think, I mean, this is now my personal view. You know, I think like a meaningful job is a very important aspect. And we see like many indicators that meaning is important, you know, well-being, you know, as you know, people are actually staying in a job more if it's meaningfulness. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing. I mean, that's my opinion. Like having a job that is meaningful is very valuable. But point well taken, you know, how much we want to interpret the advantage of it.
Maybe just like a line on the definition of advantage in this context would.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Wait,
let
so we
me,
have-
can I ask
yeah.
you then? Oh, okay. Because having a more meaningful job is good, right? Or what is, are you thinking that like these high contact female dominated jobs have other bad work conditions associated with them, which is certainly true, that makes them less advantageous? Is that correct? Have I understood that? Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Because we mentioned, or because it was mentioned, that a lot of these jobs are at the lower level of the
Right.
distribution.
Yes.
So pros and cons.
Yeah, no, I
Great.
think
So we had
we can
yeah.
definitely we can discuss that more also with our measures. You know, we can think a little bit about like, you know, does it correlate with like very negative, and maybe we don't capture it so far, you know, with like aspects that are really not as great. Because we look at, you know, even within like they're lower, I mean, they're not necessarily lower. The difference is biggest in like lower paying jobs. It's still better. It's more meaning to have a high pay, high position, ideally also prosocial job. That's like the best. But we should talk a little bit more about like what potential trade-offs come into play. Thank you.
It could, of course, be that, you know, if you're skilled enough to attain those extremely high-paying jobs, maybe the way you build meaning for you is just different, right? I mean, it's not random whether you end up at the top distribution of income or the bottom distribution, right? So yeah, it's difficult to parse out what's actually going on in between those two extremes. That's great. So Heidi asked a few questions, and they have been sort of answered. Might be, Heidi, if you have any follow-ups regarding sort of family dynamics and the role they play in building meaning. I don't know if there's something you want to add.
Nothing I really want to add. It's just that it could be a whole different conversation. So I was just it's just running through my mind the whole time how it's very different. For instance, just I think of how in my experience, and this is totally US centric and even just from my part of the US and the West Coast, and married men with children are very highly represented in a lot of community roles, whether that be in their church or on city councils or appointed to different boards and commissions. These are highly respected. They, in my experience, they seem to derive a lot of meaning from this. It's outside of their paid job. Obviously, you would have to be at a high enough income where you could do that. If you're working 2 or 3 jobs, you're not going to be able to participate. But I see far less representation of women. So I'm more interested in kind of what is the overall well-being or meaning that you get from life, both in work and outside of work, because I think that might have a bearing on the significance of the work that's being done here.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely one can, as you said, how do you correctly say, you know, meaning can come from, you know, in the job. You can coach a team, you can be whatever involved in church or whatever community organizations, and you say maybe the man compensate somewhere else. Now, what it possible? I'm not sure that we can look at this maybe, but what is, you might be right. Now, what is true is like those, it's mainly because the difference is so extreme at the lower end of the income distribution. And I don't know, what you said is like, maybe you need to be above the certain threshold to have time to like be involved in city council and coach teams in your spare time that you might not have when you're on the lower end. But we should probably think about this a little more, about like overall, not just work, but like work and life meaning.
Great. Any other open questions? We had a lot of action in the chat. Your co-authors were great at addressing those. Is there anything else? Yeah, I mean, it seems that you were afraid that this is the first time you present this, that this will be a challenge. But I mean, this is exciting work. It's exciting data too. And it seems a lot of interesting follow-up questions.
Yeah.
But yeah,
No,
Heidi,
I mean, most
like
of the credit goes to Ole and to Anna, who are just amazing co-authors.
There's a last-minute question that came in here from Heidi, which is, I also was wondering how much of this might be due to second-order beliefs, what we believe others believe is meaningful. And I guess this sort of ties back to the norms question that you sort of posed in the beginning, right? So she asked, might there be a gender difference in there as well? Yeah, do you have an intuition?
So so that they interpret the jobs differently, or they interpret what meaning is differently?
Or what they just think, what other people would think of them, and they select into those jobs. I mean, that's my interpretation of Heidi's question, but Heidi, feel free to voice that.
I guess I was a little bit curious in this trend over time, and I don't know the body of your research thoroughly enough to comment on it, but has, for instance, society's perceptions of what is or publicly expressed perceptions of what is meaningful work, has that shifted over time? So perhaps a little bit of conversation about that, what women do in their caretaking roles is more meaningful, as opposed to maybe back in the 1950s, men being the breadwinner and earning a lot of money. That was what was really meaningful, even prosocial, that's how you are a good member of society. It's just kind of throwing that out there, food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely want, with that female stereotypical job index, kind of capture a little bit what is about those norms, what is supposed to be a female job. Well, what is the perception, what is the stereotype of what should be a female job and not? And turns out it's highly correlated with those human interactive prosocial jobs. We don't know how that changed, at least with the data we have. I don't think we looked at whether that changed over time dramatically, but I agree, there is something here about like certain norms of what society might expect and what I think society might expect for me to do or not as a man or a woman.
Great. I think this was a great way of putting a pin into this presentation. Great talk, and coming to a close of NoBeC for this year. Paulius, is there anything you want to do? Last words before we let everybody go, except for Stephan?
I guess just happy holidays to everyone. Thank you for joining, and remember, we will start with the talks again on the 13th January. We will send you all the details and the video from this session to your emails, as always.
As my computer told me and everybody, we should like take some time off during. It was a tough 2 years. I think we should all get a break.
Yes, thanks everybody. Thanks, John and Ole,
Happy
for
holidays.
being here. Yes.